In my conversations with Christians, I have started to notice a growing number of believers who argue that archaeology supports many of the miraculous claims found in the Bible. When questioned about the evidence, these individuals frequently refer to dubious sources which they have uncritically accepted. One of these sources that seems to come up again and again in recent exchanges is the video Mountain of Fire, the search for the true Mount Sinai. I have watched the film twice and spent a great deal of time researching the content. I believe the video is overzealous in practically all of its claims, and whatever your disposition may be, as a Christian, atheist, or other identification, I think if the evidence is approached with an open mind and healthy skepticism, it will show that Mountain of Fire is nothing more than a mountain of faith-based presumptions. The full-length video, from which I will be using clips in this critique, will be linked to in the description box. Ever since Christianity began to spread throughout the world and time began to separate the purported events of Jesus' life and death from the so-called church age, faithful believers have sought ways to reconnect with the stories of the Bible. Prayer and Scripture help to foster that connection for many Christians, but as any religious visitor to the Holy Land will tell you, there is a different kind of perspective that is gained by going to a biblical site and seeing the stories come alive, as they say. In the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea declared a mountain in the southern portion of the Sinai Peninsula to be Mount Sinai, and this has traditionally been identified as the site of the biblical mountain since then. This proposed location has been rejected by many Christians and scholars, though, because of its failure to fit the biblical portrait, among other reasons. Over the centuries, many different people have claimed to have discovered lost relics of the Bible, like Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, Sodom and Gomorrah, the tomb of Jesus, and so forth. For some insight into the diversity of these claims, Gordon Franz observed that 14 different mountains had been proposed as the real Mount Sinai by the year 2000. Obviously, at least 13 of these have to be wrong, since they can't all be Mount Sinai, but it could just as easily be true that all 14 sites are incorrect. Thus, the suggestion of having discovered the quote-unquote real Mount Sinai is nothing new. And in fact, the particular site identified in Mountain of Fire is nothing new either. In the early 1980s, Ron Wyatt chose a mountain named Jebel al-Lawz as a candidate for Mount Sinai. What did he base this on? He based it on the location being the highest peak in Saudi Arabia, and he chose Saudi Arabia because of how it fit his theory about the location of the Red Sea crossing. For those who may be unfamiliar with Wyatt, he was an amateur adventurer who claimed to have discovered Noah's Ark, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Tower of Babel, Egyptian chariot wheels in the Red Sea, the Ark of the Covenant with the 10 Commandments and Christ's blood on the mercy seat, the site of Jesus' crucifixion, and more. Wyatt's claims have been overwhelmingly rejected by scientists, historians, Bible scholars, and other credentialed experts. In 1988, Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams, the two men who tell their story in Mountain of Fire, traveled to Jebel al-Lawz after hearing from astronaut Jim Irwin that the site was a possible location of Mount Sinai. Irwin had heard this from a man named David Fasold, who was, surprise, surprise, a partner of Ron Wyatt. Cornuke has served as a police officer and claims to have discovered the anchors from the Apostle Paul's shipwreck, as well as Noah's Ark, in addition to Mount Sinai. Larry Williams is a commodity trader who has authored several books on the subject. One might say that these two treasure hunters truly follow in Ron Wyatt's footsteps, with their lack of any qualifications and their zeal for finding Bible relics. Before the production of Mountain of Fire in 2002, Cornuke and Williams published books on their adventure and served as the subject of other media telling their tale. I mention these because they contain statements and claims not featured in the video that I will sometimes address when relevant or interesting. With this context, we are finally ready to look at the claims made in Mountain of Fire, but as one last note, some might wonder why I even bother critiquing a video on Mount Sinai. While the existence of Mount Sinai alone would not verify the supernatural claims of the Bible, there is alleged evidence presented in the film for a few of the miracles of the Exodus story. For that reason, as well as my general interest in historical and archaeological claims, I think this critique is worth the effort. Mountain of Fire begins by introducing our two treasure hunters, Cornuke and Williams, and explaining the impetus that led them on their quest. Why listen to a couple of amateurs with no qualifications in archaeology, history, or any relevant field? Williams attempts to justify their discovery.
When you look at the great archaeological discoveries of the world, they have not been found by archaeologists. Whether it's the Machu Picchu or the lost city of Ur, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you go on and on, they're found by people that are adventurers.
The other side of this coin that is not mentioned is that adventurers almost never have the final word on their discovery. In fact, many discoveries, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, were found by individuals who left it to the experts to decide their significance. There's nothing wrong with an amateur making a find, but declarations of its meaning and importance are best left to those who are qualified. I'm also not sure why Williams thinks Machu Picchu was discovered by an adventurer either, since, to my knowledge, it was Hiram Bingham, a historian who lectured at Yale, that found the site in 1911. Not exactly an amateur. Cornuke and Williams seem perfectly comfortable commenting well outside of their field of expertise, though. At several points, certain objects and designs are attributed to Egyptian origin, and yet no attempt whatsoever is made to validate such speculation. One might try and argue that perhaps these men have studied enough of ancient Egyptian culture to know what they're talking about, even if they don't hold a degree. So then provide at least a basic argument, and if not that, cite the testimony of other experts. We will look at one of these claims later and see just how horrendously presumptuous it is. When you go looking for evidence to fit a preconceived conclusion, you'll usually find it. Information can be distorted in a variety of ways, especially when there are so many available interpretations like there are with the Bible. Multiple times in the video we hear of how the Bible can be treated like a roadmap, used to guide its readers to historical truth and archaeological evidence. This is a clear indication of a preconceived conclusion on the part of these adventurers, who will filter any data through the lens of biblical literalism. It is this bias that leads Cornuke to dismiss one proposed location for the Red Sea crossing.
And the crossing site, a big part of the Exodus story, has just been avoided. People have thought it to be in the Upper Lakes region of the Suez, which is ridiculous. The Bible says that the Egyptians sunk like stones in the mighty sea. We have to have a sea, an ocean, to where they crossed the Red Sea.
Amusingly, Cornuke rejects the Suez location of the crossing not because of any substantial contradiction to the Bible, but because it doesn't fit his picture of the grandiose nature of the event. No explanation is given for why scholars believe the Red Sea crossing is connected with the Suez area, and no other argument against it is given either. For centuries, Hebrew scholars have suggested that the words Yam Suf have been mistranslated into Red Sea, and that Suf actually means reeds, as in Exodus 2:3. This would identify the body of water the Israelites crossed as the Sea of Reeds, and some have placed this location in the Gulf of Suez, a dried-up salt lake known as Lake Timsah. Further significance is that this site was connected to Pithom by a canal which was referred to as Migdol Baal Zephon by one Ptolemaic-era text. As we can see, this location for the crossing is not a blind guess, and Cornuke's dismissal of it is based on little more than personal distaste. Where do these adventurers propose the crossing site was?
If you read specifically as to what Flavius Josephus says, he describes this ridge of mountains going along, stopping into the sea, precluding them from going any other place. If you look at satellite imagery, it gives a wide, clear area along the western side of the Sinai Peninsula, almost like a highway to the tip and then turning upward, creating like a cul-de-sac area. They probably went through the Red Sea right at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula in a place called Sharm el-Sheikh. It's remarkable. It's not like a coral reef surrounding the outside of the tip of a peninsula or something that you see in normal coral reef configurations. This goes right through the sea. And it's interesting to note here that God in Scripture says, I will make for you a roadway through the sea.
Actually has a coral barrier that comes out, and Bob and I have pictures of ourselves at high tide, not low tide, with the tide up to about my waist, standing on this barrier, this reef barrier there.
Josephus was a first-century historian, but he was also a collector of various legends, and his accounting of the Mount Sinai story is extremely vague and nondescript. We are talking about someone who wrote on the Red Sea crossing over 1,000 years after its alleged occurrence, so what credibility can Josephus possibly lend in finding the actual site? The fact that he makes vague reference to mountains and does not name any specific locations to show his knowledge of the precise site gives weight to the likelihood that Josephus did not truly know and was either repeating traditions or speculating. Sharm el-Sheikh is also quite a massive distance from Egypt and the cities from which the Israelites were said to have begun their exodus. But to Cornuke and Williams, it is the best candidate because of the nearby mountains and the so-called bridge made of coral. The coral bridge is a real stretch of the imagination, since Exodus 14:16 only says, "The sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land." It requires some creative distortion to turn dry land into a coral barrier. Additionally problematic is how the Egyptians would have pursued the Israelites across this reef on chariots that were certainly not built to travel on such rough terrain. Cornuke and Williams have pictures of themselves standing knee-deep in water at high tide, and somehow we're supposed to believe the Egyptians would have been swept away off this coral bridge when the waters closed? Need I even mention the fact that no investigation is made into the area for any Egyptian remains? Aside from projecting a personal bias, there is no reason to conclude that Sharm el-Sheikh was the site of the Red Sea crossing.
If you find the correct crossing site, it's easy to find the mountain. And if you find the mountain, it's easy to find the crossing site. It all comes together. It's like a trail of breadcrumbs that leads you to the correct location in an investigation.
Cornuke and Williams have rigged the deck, filtered the evidence to fit their scenario, and this is very apparent from the woefully inadequate dismissal of the Suez location and the paper-thin case made for the Sharm el-Sheikh location. Seek and ye shall find, but what you find may just be in your own mind. Mountain of Fire relies on a couple of interesting assumptions about where the Bible places the location of Mount Sinai, as well as the geography of the region at the time. According to Cornuke, Paul places Sinai in Arabia in Galatians 4:25. This reference will only seem strange to those who don't know that the Sinai Peninsula was considered part of Arabia in ancient times. The Greek historian Herodotus stated this in the 5th century BCE, and a Greek traveler named Strabo, who was around in Paul's time, described the borders of Arabia as the Persian Gulf and the east side of the Nile. Paul's reference to Arabia could mean the Sinai Peninsula just as easily as it could mean modern-day Arabia, so Cornuke and Williams have started from a faulty understanding of their biblical roadmap. Another assumption put forward is that Mount Sinai is in the land of Midian. This interpretation comes from Exodus 3:1, where we are told that Moses was watching after the flock of his father-in-law, who was from Midian. Moses led the flock to the back of the wilderness and came upon the mountain of God. The obvious problem here is that the text doesn't specifically say that Sinai is in Midian. All it says is that Moses visited Sinai while watching his father-in-law's flock, and his father-in-law happened to be a Midianite. Does this imply that Moses was in Midian to care for Jethro's sheep? Not necessarily. Shepherds have been known to make large trips to find pasture for their sheep. But more importantly, there are a couple other verses that contradict the placement of Mount Sinai in Midian. Exodus 18 tells that Jethro went to visit Moses, who was camped out at the mountain of God. Several verses later, after an extended conversation, Jethro departs from Sinai and returns to his own land. If Mount Sinai is in Midian and Jethro was a Midianite, it wouldn't make sense for him to return to his own land, because he should have already been there. In similar fashion, when Moses prepares to set out from Sinai for the Promised Land, he invites his brother-in-law to join him. Hobab declines the invitation, saying that he will go to his own land and relatives instead. If Mount Sinai is in Midian, then why did Moses' Midianite in-laws have to leave for their own land? One other interesting statement in the Bible is that Mount Sinai is 11 days' journey from Kadesh Barnea. Looking at the terrain from Jebel al-Lawz to Kadesh Barnea, it should be easily apparent that a journey like that could not be made in only 11 days through such a heavily mountainous region. This is just one more problem with their theory that Cornuke and Williams don't even address. So what about the findings at Jebel al-Lawz? One of the first things noted by Cornuke and Williams is the black exterior of the rocks. When cracked open, the interior of the rocks is the same pinkish hue as the surrounding formations. What are we to make of this? The adventurers in the video declare this to be left over from when God descended in smoke and fire on Mount Sinai. In his book Ancient Israel and Sinai, historian and archaeologist James Hoffmeyer explains that these rocks have a case of desert varnish, which is a black to brown coating of iron, manganese, and clay, which commonly forms on exposed rock and artifact surfaces embedded in desert pavements, and it also forms in arid regions as a result of organic microbial activity on the rock surface which fixes the iron and manganese. Looking at the pictures of the burned rocks, it does appear that the coating is very surface level, and resembles a sort of clay-like covering more than burning. What's interesting is that this is a feature of many sites in Saudi Arabia, and it extends to the west of Jebel al-Lawz for approximately 15 miles. The blackened rocks also have a connection to the petroglyphs that Cornuke and Williams claim to be remnants of the golden calf altar. One can see in the footage that the petroglyphs are not engraved, as Mrs. Caldwell later states, but drawn into the varnish on the exterior of the rocks, like we draw messages in the dust that forms on cars. But who made these petroglyphs? Was it the ancient Israelites? Not unless they traveled all over Arabia doing these designs, even after Moses put an end to the calf worship. Saudi Arabia has nearly 2,000 sites with these types of drawings, and most of these date to long before the supposed time of the Exodus. Saudi archaeologists have dated the bovine petroglyphs to the Neolithic era, which is 1,000 to 3,000 years older than the Exodus, even if the Bible's timeline is taken literally. Just from looking at the petroglyphs, it's obvious to anyone who has seen cave drawings that the style is far more consistent with Neolithic art than with Egyptian art. The suggestion that these are of Egyptian origin is utterly asinine. Cornuke and Williams also found a stone structure that they call the Altar of Sacrifice, as well as white marble segments that look as if they were used in pillars. Gordon Franz spoke to an archaeologist who informed him that these are the remains of the living quarters for the miners of a marble quarry in the area. The pottery collected at the site dates to the Nabatean period, 2nd century BC to 1st century AD. White crude marble pillars were prepared there and exported to Petra for the buildings in that city. I don't know that any more needs to be said on this, given that it's the word of a qualified expert who has studied the site, versus the musings of unqualified treasure hunters driven by a preconceived conclusion. Partway through Mountain of Fire, the Caldwell family is introduced. The Caldwells went to Saudi Arabia for several years and visited the Jebel al-Lawz site, bringing pseudo-discoveries of their own to the table. We're not told what qualifications they have to evaluate their discoveries. I'm willing to bet they have none, but one of their finds is a split rock. Want to guess what they think it is?
When that rock was split in two, a geyser erupted out of the top of it. It blew those two pieces of that rock apart.
It's very interesting. This part of the world gets a half an inch of rain every 10 years, and it's so arid and so dry. Yet this rock shows distinct evidence of water erosion, not just a trickle, a burst of water flowing from it, washing out the whole mountainside, going down and washing all the sand that's down below it, creating an ancient lake bed down below.
First of all, a split rock showing signs of water erosion is not anything special or miraculous, even if it is in the desert. Water erosion typically takes time, but flash floods have been known to occur in Saudi Arabia, even as recently as this year, not to mention the 2009 floods that killed over 100 people in Jeddah. However, the water erosion theory is not actually demonstrated by the team, other than pointing the camera at rocks that look like they were more likely eroded by wind than water. Wind erosion can cut and split rocks just like the one found at Jebel al-Lawz. But whether wind or water is the culprit, no appeal to the supernatural is required. That takes a leap of faith that the Caldwells are perfectly willing to make, but that honest, qualified archaeologists usually try to avoid, at least until natural explanations are exhausted. One of the other discoveries made by the Caldwells is drawings of feet on stones. Their hypothesis is such laughably absurd conjecture that it has to be heard to be believed.
In an area that is close to the split rock, there are footprints that have been carved all over the rocks. When you pair that up with the scripture in Deuteronomy where Moses says, "To the children of Israel, you're now about to go in and possess the land, and wherever you place the soles of your feet, God will give you the land." Now that's a very interesting thing, because if you are a wandering people, how would you mark out places that you had been? If the title deed to your land is wherever you place the soles of your feet, isn't it interesting that there are so many little feet? It's very compelling.
It couldn't be that God was just telling the Israelites that he would be with them and lead them to victory wherever they went. It has to be that the Israelites would literally draw outlines of their feet and leave them behind to mark the territories they crossed. And this is true because, hey, we found some stones with feet on them. They have to fit into our preconceived conclusions somewhere. With no significant arguments or evidence remaining, Mountain of Fire has been extinguished. But most of this has not been my doing, since several claims, especially those about the Red Sea crossing, are too weak to support their own conclusion. With the evidence against Sharm el-Sheikh, the evidence against Mount Sinai being in Midian, and the overzealous presumptions of Cornuke, Williams, and the Caldwells that peel off on closer examination, the only rational verdict is that Jebel al-Lawz is not Mount Sinai. In many ways, Mountain of Fire reminds me of several conspiracy theorist documentaries I've seen on the History Channel late at night. Just like an abductee shows a strange but earthly object and proclaims it to be an alien implant without consulting any experts, these amateur adventurers show their strange but perfectly explainable finds and declare them to be evidence of miracles in Mount Sinai without consulting any experts. And just like the investigators who say the government is conspiring to hide the truth from us, these treasure-hunting teams argue that the Saudi government is suppressing the truth.
We were going to document everything we could about it, because our greatest fear was that once the Saudis realized exactly what they may have, they would come in with bulldozers and eliminate it.
The Saudis have put a fence around it, and of course they know exactly what they have.
Supposing for a moment that the conclusions drawn by these adventurers are not full of holes, what reason would the Saudi government have for hiding the true Mount Sinai? Muslims believe in the Exodus story and accept portions of the Bible as true, so these assumptions about their motives seem unwarranted. The presence of a fence can mean many things, but the meaning in this case is hardly up for debate, since the video shows footage of the signs on the fence at several times, and the signs designate the location as an archaeological site. Archaeological sites are fenced in for many good reasons, such as keeping out animals, keeping military vehicles from running over artifacts, and to protect the site from vandals, looters, and amateur adventurers who might carelessly damage things. An interesting claim made in Cornuke's book that is not in the video is that the sign reads, "No trespassing allowed, violators will be put to death." This is obviously untrue as the footage shows, but what sort of message is perhaps being sent with this possibly deliberate misquote? As previously noted, the petroglyphs are considered to be from the Neolithic period, and the stone structure mislabeled as the altar of sacrifice is thought to date to the Nabatean era. These are worthwhile sites for archaeologists to investigate in order to learn more about those cultures. Even if Jebel al-Lawz was Mount Sinai, the odds are good that archaeologists would still have come in to fence it off, because they'd want the site in as good of condition as possible. One can't expect archaeologists to leave a site open for Bible adventurers to come trampling through. But what about the alleged evidence collected by Cornuke and Williams that was thrown into the desert when they were arrested? Quite simply, we don't know that this is true, yet even if it is, I'd say that the two couldn't expect civil treatment when they forged the Saudi king's signature to get into the country. Although Williams takes the blame and Cornuke tries to play innocent and disturbed by the lie, Cornuke earlier revealed in an interview that he lied to Saudi guards about the two of them being medical doctors so that they would not be mistaken for spies. Cornuke and Williams apparently have no problem with deceit when it's in the service of their god, so who knows if the Saudi government really confiscated their evidence at all. When conspiracy theorists are challenged on their beliefs and their evidence is called into question, they almost always fall back on claims of a cover-up. The government took their best evidence. The government is keeping people from verifying the evidence because they don't want the truth exposed. If you don't believe, then you've just bought into the cover-up story. These are the hallmark excuses for a weak case, and we find them all over the comments on the Mountain of Fire video clips. In researching the history behind these investigations into Jebel al-Lawz, I couldn't help but feel like the adventurers left out and covered up details of their own, too. Cornuke claims in his book that he was the first researcher to name Jebel al-Lawz as Mount Sinai, yet this is untrue, as we've already seen, and it's hard to believe that he didn't know any better when there is a link from Ron Wyatt to David Fasold to Jim Irwin, who is the source that inspired Cornuke and Williams. Cornuke also founded the Bible Archaeology Search and Exploration Institute, which formerly had several quotes from distinguished archaeologists on its site. When an individual from Tentmaker Ministries contacted these experts to get their opinion, he found that many of them did not endorse Kornuk's claims. Since then, the quotes have been removed from the base website. One detail that was very interesting for me to learn about was the rumored gold of Exodus. Allegedly, the Israelites buried a fortune in gold that they took from the Egyptians. Rather than just the curiosity of finding Mount Sinai, discovering the gold of Exodus was also a major motivation for Kornuk and Williams, according to Bloom's book that was based on their journey. The two men were definitely treasure hunters then, but this fact is completely absent from Mountain of Fire. Perhaps a couple of guys looking for gold in them thar hills would not seem as credible as the story of two curious adventurers trying to find the real Mount Sinai. Some might ask, why would these people lie? What would they have to gain? If it's not obvious by now, the answer is money. One look at the base website shows that Kornuk is doing very well for himself with an upcoming tour in 2012, a newly released DVD, and a list of several books. Larry Williams is a Wall Street millionaire who probably saw an opportunity, if not for the gold of Exodus, then perhaps also in the Christian market. Ron Wyatt demonstrated years ago the kind of success that a pseudo-archaeologist can have in Christian circles, as his ministry received thousands of dollars from wealthy Christians. Even the Caldwells have set up their own profiteering ministry called Split Rock Research, with a wide array of items available for purchase in the store. These people may all say they're not in it for the money, but in addition to their selection of merchandise, speaking engagements may also bring in anywhere from $1,000 to $4,000, as well as the investments of wealthy elderly believers. To conclude this critique, don't be deceived. The case presented in Mountain of Fire is nothing but the speculation of Indiana Jones wannabes. I enjoy Hollywood's stories of discovering lost relics just as much as the next person, but real life doesn't work that way. Believers may be anxious to feel that their faith has historical and archaeological merit, but they should also beware of wolves in sheep's clothing, who are out for fame and fortune built on shoddy investigative work. I've not argued for a location of Mount Sinai in this video, nor have I argued that Mount Sinai is fictional. That has not been the focus here, because I don't have an axe to grind either way. But for Christians who take their Bibles to be better history books than history books, a conclusion has already been drawn. My initial appraisal rings true after all this examination. Mountain of Fire is just a mountain of faith-based presumptions.